Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're really digging into something pretty fascinating, the role of large language models, LLMs, as you probably know them, and specifically how they're starting to, get involved in the creative process for fiction writers. We've got some really compelling source material here, an analysis that goes deep into what an LLM can actually do for an author, and maybe just as importantly, what it can't.
Yeah, and what's interesting about the source, I think, is how it really tries to cut through some of the hype. It looks at the LLM as, a complex tool based on patterns, based on data. It sort of avoids making assumptions about it being like a conscious creator, gives a very grounded view.
Exactly, like a co-pilot, not the pilot, right? Mm-hmm. And this analysis, it kicks off by detailing the strengths. So maybe let's start there.
Okay, sounds good.
The first thing it really highlights is this enormous capability, vast knowledge base, and pattern recognition. What does the source say is the foundation of that?
Well, it comes down to the training data, doesn't it? I mean, think about what these models are trained on. It's just staggering amounts of text. We're talking countless novels, short stories, screenplays, but also literary analysis, writing guides. Across pretty much every genre you can imagine, the source really emphasizes that scale.
Okay, so it's basically read everything. Based on processing all that, what does the source say they can actually, recognize from it?
It means they get incredibly good at identifying patterns, like common tropes, conventions within specific genres, character archetypes, recurring plot devices. For a writer, this means the LLM can instantly flag, say, the classic elements of a noir detective story or maybe a typical fantasy quest structure.
So that's helpful, whether you want to use those tropes or maybe deliberately avoid them or twist them somehow.
Exactly. Use them or subvert them. It gives you that awareness.
Right, spotting the sort of underlying architecture. The source also mentioned their ability to do structural analysis.
Yes, that's definitely a key strength highlighted here. This material explains how LLMs can break down those well-known narrative arcs, the hero's journey, Freytag's pyramid, the classic three-act structure. They can lay out the components, the beats, which can really help a writer who's maybe outlining from scratch or trying to figure out why a draft feels a bit off structurally. Needs a rethink.
It's like having instant access to all the storytelling blueprints.
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay, so they're literary pattern spotters, structural analysts. But what about that moment every writer dreads? The blank page, writer's block. How does this source suggest LLMs can help generate new stuff, ideas?
Yeah, this is where their speed and, like you said, that access to diverse data really shines. The source points out they excel at rapid-fire idea generation based on prompts. You can ask for plot twists, character backstories, world-building details, conflict scenarios, even ideas for mashing up genres. You feed it a starting point, and it can just spin out possibilities really fast.
Wow. Okay, so a tireless brainstorming partner almost.
In a way, yes.
And what about the what-if exploration the source talks about?
Right. A writer can literally ask, okay, what if my protagonist does this instead of that in chapter 5? And the LLM, drawing on all those patterns it knows, can help map out potential consequences, different paths the story could take. The source also notes they can help shift perspective. Maybe rewrite a scene from a different character's point of view, or explore why the antagonist is doing what they're doing.
Oh, that's interesting.
Or even just drafting a passage in a totally different style to maybe shake the writer out of a particular voice or rut they're stuck in. Fresh angles.
That's actually a really clever way to use it. A perspective shifting tool.
Yeah.
The source also digs into how LLMs can potentially enhance the actual craft, the language itself, on a micro level.
Yeah, absolutely. Down to the sentence level. According to this analysis, they can suggest more precise vocabulary, synonyms, antonyms. Basically, helping refine the prose, avoid repetition, make sure the wording feels right. They can even analyze sentence structure in a paragraph, point out if it's getting monotonous, and suggest ways to vary it for better rhythm and flow.
And figurative language, too. The source mentions suggesting metaphors, similes.
Yes, again, drawing on that massive library of text they've absorbed. They can pull examples, and they can also explain principles, like the classic show, don't tell. They can explain it in concrete terms, and even take an abstract idea the writer has and suggest specific sensory details or actions to make a scene more immersive, really illustrate the concept.
It's quite a range.
Yeah.
Structure, ideas, the words themselves. What about catching mistakes?
Yeah.
Like inconsistencies in a long manuscript.
So the source does cover consistency and detail checking, but, and this is important, it adds a bit of a caveat. It acknowledges they don't understand the story, the deep narrative context, like a human would. But They can be prompted to check for inconsistencies if the relevant information is explicitly there in the text you give the model.
Ah, okay. So if character A has blue eyes in Chapter 1 and brown eyes in Chapter 10, it might flag that if you ask it to look for character description consistency.
Potentially, yes. Checking for plot points that contradict each other, or character details that shift without explanation. But the source uses that phrase, to an extent.
To an extent, yeah, that feels like a crucial qualifier there. Underscores the limitation.
Absolutely. But where they are incredibly proficient, the source really highlights this, is in spotting and correcting technical errors. Grammar, punctuation. They can even check adherence to specific style guides if you provide that information. As a proofreading tool for mechanics, they're very efficient.
And efficiency seems to be the final big strength listed here. The sheer speed and, well, availability.
Precisely. Generating text or analysis or ideas just much, much faster than a human usually can. Speeds up brainstorming, drafting. And yeah, they're available 24/7. That 3 a.m. panic or sudden burst of inspiration, your AI copilot is ready to go.
Okay, so this analysis really frames LLMs as these powerful tools, doesn't it? Things that can seriously amplify what an author does, accelerate certain parts of the writing process, and provide these kinds of data-driven insights. It paints a picture of a really capable assistant.
Definitely highlights the potential upsides.
But, and this is where, for me, it gets really interesting, the source then pivots to the limitations. If they can do all that, what can't they do? What are the weaknesses?
And this section is just as important, maybe more so, because it really gets at the irreplaceable human element in writing fiction. The most fundamental limitation the source identifies is this: lack of genuine understanding, emotion, and lived experience.
Okay, so this isn't just about technical skill anymore, is it? The source talks about no true creativity. That's a big statement.
It's a critical distinction this analysis makes, yeah. It states very clearly that an LLM doesn't feel things like inspiration or passion or that deep-seated human need to tell a particular story that comes from experience. Its creativity, according to the source, is essentially recombinatory. It's brilliant at mixing and matching patterns it learned from the training data, but it lacks that spark of genuine insight or true originality that comes from, well, human consciousness and actually living life.
So it can rearrange all the existing musical notes, maybe even in complex ways, but it doesn't know what the music feels like. It hasn't experienced joy or sorrow or fear itself.
Exactly, and that directly leads to an inability to really grasp nuance and subtlety. The source explains they don't pick up on those faint emotional undercurrents in dialogue or truly get ironic tones or understand metaphors that are deeply personal and rooted in specific experiences. The output, even if it's grammatically perfect, can sometimes feel, well, generic, or just lack real emotional depth that might seem technically correct but hollow.
And the source says they have no empathy. Not for the characters they might be writing about, or even for the reader.
That's a key point the analysis makes. They don't understand what it feels like to be a character facing a terrible choice, or what it feels like for a reader to be utterly swept away or heartbroken by a story. So yeah, they can suggest plot points or dialogue that, based on statistics from their training data, look like they should create emotional resonance. But they lack that human intuition, that gut feeling for what will truly land with visceral impact.
And what about bigger picture stuff? Theme, subtext. The source mentions they can identify themes, but maybe don't grasp the human meaning.
Right. The analysis says an LLM can scan a text, identify recurring words or concepts, and say, okay, this seems to be dealing with themes of, say, loss or redemption. But it doesn't understand the lived reality of grief or the profound personal struggle involved in redemption. So its ability to generate powerful, meaningful subtext, that stuff that lies beneath the surface, is inherently limited because it's not driven by a genuine understanding of the human condition.
That seems very closely tied to the next weakness the source brings up, the absence of personal voice and unique perspective.
Yeah, they're connected. Because these models are trained on such incredibly vast and diverse data sets, their natural tendency, if you just let them run, is to produce text that's kind of an average of all those voices they ingested. The source notes the outputs can often feel, well, generic or formulaic. Getting a truly original, distinct authorial voice out of an LLM requires more than just clever prompting. It needs significant human refinement, filtering, and shaping.
So they're like a synthesizer that can mimic the sound of any instrument, but they don't have their own inherent unique tone or style.
That's a pretty good analogy, yeah. And the source also points out they tend to struggle with generating genuinely revolutionary ideas or maybe deeply philosophical concepts, things that really break from existing ways of thinking. They're much better at recombining what's known than inventing something radically new from scratch.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly. What about feedback? We know human editors, beta readers are crucial. Can an LLM step into that role? Provide useful, critical feedback?
Well, according to this analysis, the answer is pretty clearly no, not in the way humans do. The heading is literally inability to provide true critical feedback. The core issue is they simply don't have taste or subjective literary judgment in the human sense. Their critiques are based on identifying statistical patterns, following grammatical rules, checking against conventions learned from their training data. It's not based on aesthetic judgment or artistic merit, or whether a piece of writing is genuinely moving or thought-provoking.
So it can tell you if you used a comma incorrectly, but it can't tell you if a sentence is beautiful or clunky, or if it perfectly captures a fleeting feeling.
Precisely. The source really emphasizes they can't tell an author if a story lacks heart, or if a character just doesn't feel real, or if the pacing drags in a way that kills the emotional tension. All that incredibly valuable, subjective feedback that human readers provide. LLMs can't replicate that. Their feedback is technical, structural, not about the artistic soul or emotional impact of the work.
And presumably, they wouldn't know if you were deliberately breaking a writing rule for artistic effect versus just making a mistake.
That's another good point the source makes. An LLM might flag something that deviates from standard grammar or narrative structure because it's a pattern mismatch in its data, but it can't discern the author's intent. It doesn't know if you're breaking a rule cleverly to create a specific effect or if it's just an error.
The source also brings up a couple of other sort of broader limitations related to the data they're built on and just the nature of the models themselves.
Right. One is the risk of reinforcing biases and stereotypes, which makes sense, right? As the analysis points out, because their training data is just scraped from vast amounts of existing human textbooks, the internet, etc., LLMs can inadvertently pick up and then perpetuate biases, stereotypes, or even harmful narratives that are present in that data, unless they're very carefully prompted and the output is closely monitored.
That's a really important ethical consideration. And speaking of ethics, the final point is lack of accountability and moral compass.
Yeah, another key limitation noted by the source, LLMs themselves don't possess any kind of moral framework or ethical compass. Now, they can be programmed with safeguards, rules about generating certain types of content, but the analysis highlights that fundamentally they don't have inherent values. They could potentially generate disturbing or unethical content if not properly constrained. And this contrasts sharply with a human author, who brings their own conscience, their own moral considerations, their own accountability to the themes and content they choose to explore and create.
Okay, so if we sort of wrap up all these weaknesses identified in the source material, it really seems to boil down to the LLM fundamentally lacking those uniquely human elements. The genuine lived experience-driven creativity, the capacity for deep emotion, a personal voice, subjective artistic judgment, and an ethical dimension.
That really captures the core message from the analysis regarding the limitations, yeah. They're presented as not being a substitute for the human writer's unique vision, their intelligence, their experience, and ultimately their creative ownership.
So pulling this all together then, this source material seems to give us a very clear picture. On the one hand, the LLM is presented as an incredibly powerful tool, a co-pilot maybe, with huge capabilities for speeding things up, analyzing patterns, generating ideas based on existing data, handling technical checks like grammar.
Absolutely, a powerful amplifier and accelerator. And it's a big, but crucially, it lacks those fundamental human qualities, the things that give rise to truly original insight, deep emotional connection, an authentic voice, subjective artistic choice, and that inner drive that comes from personal experience and wanting to communicate something meaningful. It can mimic the surface, perhaps incredibly well, but it doesn't feel or live the substance underneath.
And this really brings us to a fundamental question, maybe for you, the listener, to think about, especially as these AI tools get even more sophisticated. How does the role of the human writer evolve in a world with such capable AI assistants? What parts of crafting a story, of creating art, will always require that irreplaceable spark of human experience, human consciousness, human intent? The things an algorithm, no matter how advanced, simply can't replicate.
Yeah, it's something definitely worth reflecting on, especially as you encounter and maybe even start to interact with AI-assisted creative work more and more in the future.
This has been a deep dive, really unpacking this analysis of the strengths and the weaknesses of LLMs when it comes to assisting fiction writers.